But all right. So thank you very much for this invitation, Dr. Bharat, wherever you've gone, and the IIT Indore. It's a great joy to be here. This course is roughly based on the book Indian Political Theory, and the book Indian Political Theory opens with an unusual sentence about how difficult the book is. Dr. Bharat was kind enough to say that I write in an accessible way, and I always try to, but there are some disciplines that are inherently difficult. And Indian political theory, especially one that attempts to approach the topic in terms of Swaraj, and of course we'll discuss what that might possibly mean, is something that is inherently difficult, something that is a challenge to write about in a way that makes the reader's life simple. Now, there's a reason for that, because if you look at the title, Indian Political Theory, Laying the Groundwork for Swaraj, the four major concepts, Indian Political Theory and Swaraj, are four contested concepts. So I think you might be aware of concepts that are referred to as essentially contested. Obviously, each of these terms is an essentially contested concept. Theory is in itself difficult. I think tomorrow I'm going to discuss the nature of theory and what theory is supposed to achieve. But there are hardly any agreements on what theory is, how you do it, what qualifies as theory, what qualifies as valid or legitimate theory, and what gets disqualified because of the methodology that's used. Political. If there's any concept that is contested, it is the concept of the political, which, as some of you know, is a classic work by Carl Schmitt, the German jurist and one of the greatest political theologians of the 20th century. The concept of the political is itself complicated. Schmitt identifies it as essentially consisting of a distinction between friends and enemies. Now imagine that compared to, let's say, a Gandhian conception of the political. Would Gandhi define the essence of the political in terms of a distinction between friends and enemies? Absolutely not. So you have, on the one hand, one of the most influential European political theologians, political theorists, giving a conception of the political that is, on the other hand, contested by a conception that many of us share, which is not a fundamentally bellicose conception of the political, but one instead that leads to some conception of harmony and unity. Indian political theory. So my friend Gopal Guru at JNU has criticized this book. He was nice enough to endorse it, but he actually doesn't like it very much, stating that what is, with this use of the term Indian, how does he put it, do concepts have a geography? I believe that's the expression that he uses. Do concepts have a geography? And as many of you are philosophers, we like to believe that concepts entail some sort of universality abstracted from the specificity of the circumstances where they arose. And if they are abstractable from the circumstances within which, or out of which they arose, then they can easily travel. And to restrict a concept by an adjective, a qualification like Indian or German or what have you, is to do a certain injustice to the nature of the concept being discussed. So the idea of referring to something as Indian is both conceptually problematic from the point of view of theory, and then of course it is empirically problematic. What qualifies as Indian? As we all know, this is itself currently a highly contested issue, primarily in terms of nationality, nationalism, or the nation. So what's the correlation between Indian and the nation? We know there is one. Nobody's quite sure how to align them. But what we do know, as I'll discuss at some length in the next lecture, there are essential components that basically people agree on when they try to determine what constitutes a nation or the nation. But these themselves are contested. Okay? Language, race, religion, and so on. So you have the problem of theory as contested, you have the problem of the political as contested, you have the problem of Indian or India as contested, and then of course Swaraj. What do we mean by Swaraj? This has been a constant debate from 1870s to today. So what I'm trying to tell you is you have some very difficult homework, some very difficult reading, because this book is not an easy book. But the reason that it's not easy is because the issues that it's dealing with are not easy. It is about essentially contested notions and essentially contested norms. And if these were easy things, would we find ourselves in the situation that we find ourselves in? Okay? Global poverty, environmental catastrophe, national struggles, violence. These are the order of the day, right? The order of the day is not that each of us wakes up and gets embraced by a loving blanket of justice and equality and dignity is handed to us and so on. Everything is a struggle. And everything is a struggle because to find the solutions is a complicated matter. So what we try to do in political theory is to come up with theorizations that make it possible to understand the empirical world in a manner that will advance us in some respect to the norms or values or principles that more or less, for the most part, we all share. Now, that's not an easy thing. Each one of you knows that that's not an easy thing. Consequently, if you're going to study the discipline or the disciplines that are involved in trying to achieve a step like that, you have to work hard for it. And it's not an easy book to read by any stretch of the imagination. I apologize for that, but it's not an easy set of problems that any of us faces. And if the problems are not easy, how can the theorizations of those problems be easy? Now, the title of this introductory talk was, is it time for a new Orientalism, or something like that. Now, what does that mean? What was the first Orientalism? So, is it time for a new Orientalism assumes that people are more or less familiar with the 1978 work of Edward Said, Orientalism. Is that something that people are more or less familiar with? And be careful if you say yes, because I'm going to ask you about it. So we have a very confident person on that. So let me get you a microphone. So what I would like to see is what can you just give us a brief idea of Orientalism as you understand it? Yes. Yes, and so you're suggesting there are other ways of viewing it as well.
I think, well, I don't know if I would use the word Orientalism, but yes, there are certainly other ways of turning that gaze.
Right, okay, okay. Thank you so much. So this is beautiful. I thought that there's no reason for you to hear my monotonous voice all the time, so we had a nice intervention there. This is wonderful what you have pointed out. It also represents the majority of interpretation of the significance of the concept, which is perfect. There is, however, something that happened in the book Orientalism that doesn't get a lot of focus and attention, and I think, in addition to how you've described it, we need to turn our attention to it very specifically. So, in the you used the word gaze, I believe. In this gaze towards the Orient, there is a representation or depiction of the so-called East that became codified and instantiated through production of academic knowledge and the reproduction of that knowledge through curriculums and syllabus throughout the world. And the irony is that one of the places where the Orientalist gaze has been most concretely and firmly institutionalized is in our universities in India itself. So the origin of the modern Indian public university is directly, genealogically linkable to the very processes of the reproduction of colonial knowledge that were begun in colonial Europe. That means that we, on the one hand, believe that we occupy or we live in a place other than where this knowledge is generated. But this is in some respects a false belief, because as I try to argue in the book and in a number of other books, as strangely as I started with a book on Indian wine about 10 years ago, all the way up to the current book on Indian law, which is coming out in a couple of months. We are producing Orientalist knowledge in the Orient to such a degree that I believe, as somebody who teaches most of my career outside of India in the so-called Western world, I believe we produce more Orientalist knowledge than the West. Just as some of you who are whiskey drinkers know we produce more Black Label in India than in the UK, we also produce more Orientalist knowledge in India than the West. Now, that's not a contention that I want to argue. You can take it however you like. If you want, I'll reduce the grandness of the claim and just say that we continue to reproduce Orientalist knowledge. And I don't think that's anyone who is aware of the syllabus of any central university in this country knows that our syllabus is an Orientalist reproduction of forms of knowledge, both in terms of content and in terms of form. And in this respect, form is more important. I'll get into this distinctions between form and content. It's a basically Hegelian notion for those of us in the modern social sciences. It derives, of course, from Aristotle, but the form of our institutional learning is precisely the reproduction of colonial knowledge forms. And this makes a difference, because when we start to produce knowledge, and I'll discuss what knowledge production is in a moment, then are we producing it in terms of the debates that were going on at the time, the era of the decolonization process? The idea of Swaraj, from Tilak all the way to K.C. Bhattacharya's famous talk on Swaraj and ideas. Is that the way that the form of our contemporary public university knowledge production in the humanities and social sciences takes? Obviously not. Institutionally so. Now, this is one thing I had mentioned. The important part about Syed then that gets undue insufficient attention is that the production of, or the depiction of the Orient that occurs through the Orientalist gaze is not only a constitution of the other. As I had just said, we have been constituted and we reproduce that constitution in our own knowledge forms. It is not only the constitution of the other that gets created by the Orientalist gaze. What else happens? So I think the reason that Syed's book is so significant is not merely because he shed light on something that I think more or less everybody knew. It had just not been formulated very precisely. but because the essential thesis of the work is that what is created by the Orientalist gaze is the West itself, right? So it's not so much that the Orientalist gaze represents or depicts the Orient in terms of a static, a mystical, a decadent, you know, all of the pictures of the Orient, right? With our shishas, hookahs, dancing courtesans, and all of these things. It's, yeah. So it's not merely these representations of the other. It's the fact that the only way the self gets constituted is by representation and differentiation from the other. And so the construction of what we know of as the West is a product of Orientalism and not the cause of Orientalism. And this is a very crucial point of Edward Said's, and it's the one that I take up as a premise in Indian political theory. It is not that there was some autonomous, free, independent West that colonized and produced a colonized East. It is that the very process of the colonization and depiction, Orientalist depiction of the Orient, is what created what we know of as the West. So the West is a consequence of colonization, just as much as the East is a consequence of colonization. And this is a very important and studied or under-investigated, but I think crucial aspect of Orientalism. So if this is the 1978 book, Orientalism, and as we're going to discuss in the next hour, whenever that is, I'll have to find out how we're doing the timing now. From the book Orientalism arose post-colonial theory as we know it, decolonial theory as we know it, comparative political theory as we know it, and I believe Indian political theory as I lay it out. That means contemporary Indian political theory. As you know, or as you, I assume you know, generally when we talk about Indian political thought within Indian academia, political science, or philosophy departments, what we're talking about is everybody who's dead. Okay, so it's a very strange thing that all of the books called contemporary Indian political thought or contemporary Indian philosophy, I don't know what we mean by contemporary because nobody is alive. Okay, so when I use the word contemporary in this book and in its predecessor, 2010 book, Indian Political Thought, I made a point when I was selecting the authors for Indian Political Thought, the 2010 reader, I don't know if you've seen Indian Political Thought, I made a point that the condition for entry, one of them was that you should have a heartbeat. Okay, what I say about Indian political theory then, I'm referring to contemporary Indian political theory as we know it, is like post-colonial, decolonial, and comparative political theory, a consequence of the 1978 book, Orientalism. So it is a foundational text. It's foundational for the part that you had eloquently articulated, what it creates or manifests through its representations, but it is also, I think most significantly, a foundation for Indian political theory because it recognizes and explains the mechanism according to which it is not simply that the other gets created by an autonomous self, but that the self gets created in the process of representing the other. Now, I know many of you are political scientists, some lawyers, and some philosophers. These are my three disciplines. I basically work in law departments, political science departments, and philosophy departments. So what I'm going to do is sometimes switch my examples from law to political science to philosophy. And so some of you will get some of it, and some of it you will get other aspects of it. Let me discuss the difficulty of Indian political theory for lawyers. We have a concept that is referred to as hard cases, right? Who are the lawyers here? The hard cases. So what is a hard case? A hard case is a case that is essentially constitutional, right, and foundational, not procedural. Procedural cases are very easy cases. So if any of you has ever been in a court or engaged with the justice system, what you know is that judges really don't want to get into the merits of a case at all. They want to solve this issue, dismiss this at the level of procedure. Was something done wrong rather than let me decide who's right? Okay? So these are easy cases, procedural ones. Merit-based cases are hard cases. In Indian political theory, the reason that we face such a difficulty is because we have to proceed on the merits. So we have to move into the substance of the issues, the essentially contested concepts. What does it mean to be Indian? What does it mean to do theory? What is the nature of the political? And what on earth can Swaraj mean in the year 2017? But there's also the procedural side. Procedural side is, how do you do it methodologically? What is it that, what techniques are we going to use to determine who constitutes or speaks for India? Or what is the nature of the political? What methods are you going to use? Anytime that you approach substantive questions, the merits of the issue, you use specific procedures. So those of you who are philosophers know the long-standing divide between Anglo-American analytic versus continental approaches. We have, you'll hear how vicious that argument can become later in the day. The reason that I mention this is that the way that I approach Indian political theory in order to come out with a viable, authentic alternative to the Orientalist reproduction of knowledge is through various methodological techniques, and one of them I refer to as pratyahara. Now, Pratyahara. Now, the Greek term for this is epoche. Epoche. Yeah. So, sorry? You know that I am a professor of ancient Greek, right? No. Okay. It's called epoche. All right. Now, I'll just help this side. So, what does it mean? Those of you who are philosophers know of it as Cartesian doubt, okay? Or in phenomenology, Husserl was the originator of this. Are you okay with Husserl? Husserl. Okay. This is going to be difficult. Yeah. Can you give him a copy of the Hegel book? No? Okay. All right. Now, Husserl, or Husserl, if you, he introduces this notion in what he refers to as Cartesian meditations. Okay, why are they referred to as Cartesian meditations? Because they are abstractions, pulling away from. Okay? Now, this form of abstraction or pulling away is an exercise undertaken because of the failures or the misdirections that knowledge has led the theorist or the philosopher or the political scientist or what you will, the agent, epistemic agent, the way that knowledge has led to misdirections, falsities, fictions in its pursuit. So when you find that you reach an impasse in the generation or production of knowledge, it is a common phenomenon, and we've seen it in the history of intellectual thought from ancient to contemporary times, to stop and reassess. So you saw this very simply in the Discourse on the Method for Rightly Conducting Reason in the Sciences. This is Descartes, which got simplified in Cartesian Meditations. The full title of the French version is The Discourse on the Method for Rightly Conducting Reason in the Sciences, which is what? Because reason has been conducted wrongly in the sciences. And so a new methodological technique is required. And that new methodological technique was referred to simply as, everybody knows it, dubito, I doubt, the doubting. Now this doubting is an epistemic restraint. Okay? An epistemic restraint in the sense that limitation on what I can claim to know, and a reorientation or a return to what I can be certain about knowing. And Husserl, after recognizing what he referred to as the crisis of the European sciences, the crisis of knowledge up until that time, which, as you know, I hope, his greatest student, Heidegger, recognized as fundamentally characterizing the entire history of so-called Western philosophy, a misdirection, right? What he referred to as an ontotheological misdirection. So Husserl says, we have a crisis, what do we need to do? And his call was to go back to the things themselves, right? What does that mean? What does it mean to go back to the things themselves? It means to return to a pre-theorized understanding, an understanding that is generated based on an epistemic skepticism which allows us neither to be overly influenced by what we have inherited in knowledge traditions, or what we are told is the nature and structure of knowledge, or what we have speculatively believed about the nature of things. So many of us are religious. Perhaps we believe in metempsychosis. Perhaps we believe, if we're Christians, in a heaven, or whatever that happens to be. Even Descartes had such a belief. Even Husserl had such a belief. But in both cases of this methodological abstraction, this epoché, this doubt, this epistemic skepticism, radical epistemic skepticism, they said, let's just deal with what we know and how we come to know it, and whether we can know how we come to know what we know. Now there's another person you are all probably familiar with who undertook the same exercises. He referred to it as an experiment with truth, right? Now this has been a common technique and method of deploying one's internal resources in order to achieve a certain sort of authenticity of knowledge. So methodologically, what we can take for pursuing, filling out how we substantively deal with inherently contested concepts like what does it mean to be Indian, what is the political, what is theory, what is Swaraj. Methodologically, what we can do is do what every great mind in the past has done when he or she finds him or herself at an impasse of knowledge, and that is to extract, to start to deploy a kind of epistemic skepticism and tell yourself that I will not import unnecessary knowledge traditions. I will not deploy my assumptions, metaphysical assumptions, metempsychosis, my religious beliefs, theological assumptions, and instead, to quote from Husserl, go back to the things themselves. So what are the things themselves? What is Indian? What is the political that we encounter or experience? And what does it mean to do theory? Where did this concept come from? Where did it originate? Why have the conditions for valid theory been constructed in the way that they are? And so what the first couple of chapters of this book do, that it would be nice if you read before, after you recuperate from your long journey and so on, is that they begin to reflect on what does it mean to do theory, what does it mean to be Indian, what is the nature of Swaraj, what is this authenticity supposed to be, where do you find it, and what are the methods that any individual could deploy in order to be able to come up with a characterization or set of hypotheses about these concepts that are not overly rich in metaphysical speculation. They're not overly rich in assumptions of pre-existing knowledge, and they are not fixed and determined about the nature of tradition. So a new Orientalism, so the first Orientalism in 78 laid the foundation for the rapid construction of at least 4 forms of new forms of knowledge: post-colonial theory, decolonial theory, comparative political theory, and Indian political theory. And this is a historical fact. You can ask any author within those traditions, what is it that woke them up? And each of them points to Said. Younger generation points to 1985. I'll discuss that in the next lecture, what happened in 1985. But in 1978, the publication of Orientalism really produced these new forms of knowledge. But what were the methodological forms within which these 4 new knowledge systems were generated? So we have new substance in decolonial, postcolonial, comparative, and Indian political theory. But what is the form, the procedure, the method? The method has always been that very same method that is critiqued by Orientalism itself. So when I suggest that it's time for a new Orientalism, what I suggest is, in some respects, to complete the project of Orientalism itself by recognizing something that we have failed to recognize about this text, which is that it's not just about the other, it's about the way that the construction of the other is a process of self-constitution. And the process of self-constitution then can also determine your experiential relationship with the other. As you all know, you have assessments of people that you meet. You're probably thinking some very, why does this guy walk back and forth so much? Or, whatever. Everybody has an immediate assessment of those whom they encounter. That means that the constitution of the other is a condition of your self-constitution. But what happens in that assessment? The other person is doing something which means something about me as well. So there's a mutuality in this constitution. Constitution of the other gives rise to the self, and the origins of the self can be found in the processes of constitution of the other. Now I'm closing with this in terms of what Orientalism means, because now I have to get very philosophical. I'll come back to this topic later, but I want to end with a point on what does it mean to get back to the things themselves, methodologically. So why Husserl said back to the things themselves within the history of philosophy in the 19th century is fundamentally because of the way that the evolution of thought from Descartes to Kant created circumstances that required that the logical conclusion for Kant's way of thinking was that we have no access to the things themselves. So if across the social sciences, I assume you're aware of this notion of the critique of pure reason, the Kantian first critique, which suggests that we do not have access to things themselves. We have access to the way things appear that get constituted by concepts of the understanding, what are referred to as categories of the understanding, and the pure forms of intuition, space and time. So through the categories of the understanding that are imposed by the self, objects, or rather phenomena, are constituted as objects. I apologize, I told you I was going to get very philosophical. Don't worry, we'll get back to the political. But just understand the problem that we face here, that there's an assumption that pure experience is not something to which a subject has access to, but the subjectivity of a subject, what it means to be a subject, is constituted by that process of experience itself. You can put it another way, that unless there is an object of intention, then you're not even conscious, right? Think about if you're meditating, what is the very aim or procedure according to which you meditate? Precisely to try to transcend intentionality, right? That consciousness is consciousness of. And we use substitutions of the of, like some mystical cosmic principle or a sound, an Om sound or something like this. We try to use that to substitute the object, which is the normal object of intentionality of wakeful consciousness. Do you understand what I'm saying? So in the processes of meditation, what we're trying to do is transcend intentionality by giving symbolic substitution for the object. But the point is that from the time of Kant to the time of Husserl, it was more or less assumed that we do not have access to things in themselves. We have access to things as they appear. And the things as they appear get constituted as objects because of the categories of the understanding and the pure forms of intuition, which are within the subject. But a subject is not a subject unless the subject is intentional, right? We've just said that. So what does that mean? Don't worry, we're almost to the end of this. What it means is the horrible expression that Husserl's student Heidegger articulated, which goes like this: the subjectivity of the subject is constituted by the objectivity of the object. Okay, I'm sorry for damaging you in your ears in this way. The subjectivity of the subject is constituted by the objectivity of the object. But how is the objectivity of the object constituted? By the subjectivity of the subject. Okay, because you have only appearance unless you have the categories of the understanding which constitute the subjectivity of the subject. But the subjectivity of the subject is dependent upon intentional states, right? Otherwise you're a corpse, or you're, in the other analogy, you're meditating, which means that you have, in fact, as close as humanly possible, absolved the materiality of subjectivity. Why does this matter? Why does it matter that the subjectivity of the subject is constituted by the objectivity of the object? Think back to Orientalism. So we know that the main interpretation of Orientalism is that the object was, the other was constituted by the self. But every philosopher who has been become aware of the tradition of modern philosophy in the so-called West, from Kant to the 21st century, knows that processes of constitutions of otherness are preconditions for selfhood, selfness. Now, why this matters to us is because what is Swaraj? Yeah. Okay, what is the Swa? What is it? Self. So we get the self how? So now remember what we've learned from Kant to Husserl to Heidegger. Remember on the other side what we've learned from Orientalism in the constitution of the four knowledge, new knowledge forms that exist in contemporary times: post-colonial, decolonial, comparative, and Indian political theory. The self gets constituted at the same moment of emergence of the constitution of the other, and the constitution of the other is the moment of emergence of the Swa. That means that Swaraj, which I had mentioned, is another essentially contested concept along with Indian and political and theory. Why I delayed discussing Swaraj is because first we had to move through this philosophical swamp before we get there. Any conception of the swa of Swaraj has got to be achieved, delineated, attempted, demarcated, philosophized in terms of the relationship that it constitutes external to the self. You cannot achieve mystical, abstract, alienated, solitary Swaraj. But this is strange because we have so-called traditions that seem to suggest that the attainment of our highest expression is achieved only when you leave the mundane aspects of the world, right? And go off and philosophize. But interestingly, as I hope some of you know, political scientists and sociologists, economists, I think everybody should know this, Marx's first critique was about what he called the Robinsonades, right? Robinsonades. In other words, the suggestion that, you remember Robinson Crusoe, who goes off by himself, and then if you're alone, you can have a perfectly just and pure and moral life. But what about the political? The very definition of the political comes from the Greek word polis, right? The city. We can call it as the state. You don't have a state of one, right? So if Swaraj is a fundamentally, as Gandhi argued, moral and political concept, then it has to be conceived in relation to the impact on the other. It cannot be conceived according to some of our ascetic traditions, where one goes and disappears from the polis. When one goes and disappears from the polis, it is what Marx refers to as a Robinsonade, that it is a wonderful thing, but it is no longer political. And if it is no longer political, it is not going to help achieve authenticity or justice or fairness or equality or any of the norms that we eventually will come to. Nobody is saying these are the norms that we want yet, because we're proceeding according to methodological doubt, right? Nobody has said equality. Why not inequality? But irrespective of what it is, these are all terms of relationships of self and other, which is the nature of the political. In Carl Schmitt, whom I had mentioned, it's a friend-enemy. Self are the friends, the other is the enemy. But even in our harmonious conceptions, it is not a harmony of one with oneself. This is referred to as authenticity. It is a harmony of one with the other. Okay. Now, this is in some respects the political and philosophical, the empirical and theoretical horizon according to which we realize that Said's Orientalism was a monumental work because it was the precondition for, in some respects, a liberation of our minds from the colonial content of knowledge. But have we achieved a liberation in the colonial form of knowledge? By no means. And look at any syllabus tells you that. So how is it, are we going to go native, as the colonizers used to say? Are we going to seek indigeneity? Is it that we are going to resuscitate our great theories that, what is Pratap Mehta's father's name? V.R. Mehta suggests that, we can find it in Manu. Everything that we need to organize contemporary political life can be more or less found in Manusmriti. Is this the way that we are going to organize our 21st century knowledge production? Well, why not? Because the conception of Swaraj necessarily entails an acknowledgement and understanding of the implications on the other. So think about whatever we propose as the solutions to these notions about what it means to be Indian, what it means to be political, what it means to do theorization, we cannot continue to think about them in a way modeled on the colonial notions of essentially superiority and extraction. This is how colonial mindset worked, right? Superiority. Indians are static, they're childish, they're brutes, they're heathens, and they're hedonists. Okay, so they're inferior. And let's get as much out of them as we can. Extraction. So contemporary political theory in India, or the production of social science knowledge as such, political theory being just one example of it, has to not only liberate itself in terms of its content by following what Orientalism said in terms of the depiction of the other, it also has to follow it in respect to the constitution of the other and the acknowledgement that what it means to be a self is determined by the relationship that we create politically between self and other. Consequently, any way that we decide to determine our norms and principles are not to be self-mediated, exclusively self-mediated. For example, a Nietzschean perspective. Some of you are readers of Nietzsche. You know this is the notion of the self-sovereign, right? The person who transcends. In Nietzsche's conception, the person transcends fundamentally himself. But it's because other people don't matter. Other people, what are other people? So that we're not going to organize political life based on a conception of self-sovereignty. We have to organize political life based on a conception that that very self that we think we can cultivate into sovereignty is constituted by the nature of the others with whom we have relations. Now, any of you who knows Hegel understands that this is nothing other than the master-slave dialect, right? So I'll leave it with a conclusion on this point, that it's time for a new Orientalism because we need to decolonize ourselves not only in terms of content but in terms of form. We need to decolonize ourselves not only in terms of what we say but how we say it. And we need to decolonize ourselves because who we are is a construction not of some inherent isolated island process, but who we are, which means, and whether we achieve any of our own goals and aspirations, is a gift from our community. It is dependent upon what is offered to us in order to become who we are or what we are. So to take our particular vantage point, who we have become as autonomous adult males or females, generally it's males who dictate these things, to take the vantage point of your position and say, I'm a neutral party who will determine what is best, is to fundamentally mistake the very conception of authenticity. So as we pursue authenticity in the social sciences in India, we have to pursue that authenticity in terms of recognizing that our own authenticity, our own privileged position, I'm a person of multiple privileges, caste, class, gender, all of these privileges I enjoy. Am I going to then theorize based on the normalization of my privileges? Absolutely not. I have to theorize based on recognizing that you're privileged because you're privileged from, right? A privilege is a movement from point A to B. So I'm privileged from A to B. And when I start to theorize the nature of the political, I have to theorize from point A, not from point B. The things themselves, the origins of things. So the new Orientalism that we need to pursue in the social sciences in India need to be pursued in a decolonization, in a sloughing off, in a pulling away from, an epoche from colonial forms of knowledge and colonial content of knowledge and colonial forms of privilege colonial forms of extraction, colonial forms of domination, which, to get back to the very first point I made, are no longer produced in the West. They're produced by us. They're produced by me as a professor. They're produced by each of you who stand in front of classrooms telling people the nature of things without realizing your privilege, without realizing your position, without realizing your vantage, and deploying these in terms of judging other people as inferior, the same way that the British, the colonizers, did. So we have undertaken an internal process of colonization, both in terms of content in our syllabus and in terms of form, in the way that professors interact with students, in the way that administrators interact with professors. In all of these forms, we have replicated the colonial process and done so for precisely the same reasons: self-satisfaction and extraction. Okay, so it's time for a new Orientalism, because we have to proceed in the social sciences in India by total doubt and turning away from the forms that we have inherited. So where do we go from here? That's the topic of the next topic.
Thank you, Aakash, for